we're celebrating India at 64. We're also celebrating 20 years of economic reforms, reforms that have really transformed our country, and independence that's clearly core to our existence. But we're also a nation that's battling high prices and grappling with a dip in growth. So what should really policy making be for the future? How will growth be sustainable, and can inflation really spoil the party for us? To discuss that and a whole lot more on the special show, we've got an expert panel of top economists, global investors and key decision makers within the government. It's a pleasure to have Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, Punita Kumar Sinha, Senior Managing Director of Blackstone Asia, Chetan Iyer, Managing Director and Chief Economist for Asia Pacific Morgan Stanley, and Jahangir Aziz, Chief Economist for India for JP Morgan. Let's start with the whole growth versus inflation debate, because that's really center stage to our economy right now. And who better than Montek Singh Ahluwalia to take up the first question. Mr. Ahluwalia, good to have you on this show. Your government seems to have been battling with this question. The main opposition is up in arms against it. I'm going to be asking you the same question as well. Do you think as a nation we are fixated with growth a tad too much?
I don't think we are too fixated with growth. I mean, growth is very important, and it is one of the successes of the economic reforms. But we've consistently said that growth has to be with a moderate rate of inflation, and that's the objective of the government, of monetary policy and fiscal policy. You know, at the same time, you can't sort of forget about growth, because it's really growth that is achieving many of the things that we want in terms of social progress, generating revenues to pay for schemes to increase inclusiveness, etc.
All right. A word in from the policy makers. We are not fixated with growth, and which is why I'm going to throw open this debate on growth versus inflation. Punita Kumar Sinha, to you first. Near-term growth has, of course, been sacrificed for taming inflation. That hasn't happened. Do you think that's been a largely pragmatic approach by the government?
You know, I think right now growth across the globe is slowing down, and Indian economy is actually doing quite well in the context of, you know, global slowdown. And inflation, of course, has been going up not just in India but across a lot of different emerging economies, primarily obviously due to commodities, and food inflation has been a problem as well. So inflation has to be tackled, because if you don't tackle inflation, then you have political issues. And whether that means growth has to be sacrificed, I think growth probably needs to be managed so that it's not a growth that's led by inflation.
Fair point. Growth has to be managed so that it's not led by inflation. Let's get in Chetan Iyer in this debate. Chetan, you've been rather scathing of the government's growth projections. We are going to chew your brains a little more on this later. But let me first ask you, in growth versus inflation, the government has, of course, opted to tame inflation and has sacrificed growth. Do you think this has been a pragmatic approach, or do you think this is a decision that they will really repent at leisure?
I think the controlling of inflation is very important. So understand that when market says that this is sacrifice of growth, I would say it's not. It's sacrifice of the very near-term growth, but for long-term sustainability of growth, controlling inflation is very necessary. So I think the RBI is doing the right thing.
All right. The RBI doing the right thing is the word from Chetan Iyer of Morgan Stanley. Let's take this debate to JP Morgan and get Jahangir Aziz at this moment. Jahangir, I know you're not someone who really agrees with this whole growth versus inflation debate. You think it's rather lopsided. Inflation is perhaps at too high levels to even talk about this?
I think so. I mean, look, I mean, this growth inflation debate, which, you know, keeps cropping up in India. If you look at historical evidence, both in India and especially abroad, if you look at inter-country comparisons and look at what has happened in other countries, this entire trade-off is always there only at very low levels of inflation. You can talk about, you know, going from 3% to 4%, 5%, and you're going to lose a little bit on the growth front. Or if you want to bring down inflation from 5-6% to 3-4%, you're going to lose a little bit more. So I think the thing that people missed is that when inflation is at double digits, which is what it is now, we had last month print was 9.4. We know for all practical purposes it's going to get raised to 10.2. At inflation rates at 10%?
Absolutely. You cannot talk about inflation at double digits and debate growth then. A contrarian on the show, always good to hear you. But let me take this discussion back to Punita Kumar Sinha, and I'm going to actually ask you to clarify and perhaps expound upon the point that you made earlier on, that growth should be better managed. It needs to be sustainable growth. We keep hearing this word so very often, but what according to you is sustainable growth after all?
Growth has to be a balanced growth. I don't think the number of 8 or 7 or 9 is that important as the quality of the growth and the way the growth is happening in the economy. So I think currently there are some elements of growth that are not very healthy, and therefore I think that those need to be addressed so that you can have longer term sustainable economic growth, even if it's not 9% one year, because very high growth in one year can also lead to cyclical problems in the future years. So you really need to manage the growth.
Managed growth is what Punita Kumar Sinha continues to assert. And let's take this discussion to Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Mr. Ahluwalia, everybody keeps talking about sustainable growth. And let's get a view from within policy making. We've heard global investors like Punita speak about how should growth be better managed, what really is the sustainable model of growth. But to you, and somebody who's within policy making, who's looking at making policy for the future, what is sustainable growth? I mean, what ensures that growth will be sustainable?
Well, I think sustainability can be viewed in two different ways, and in the current debate, they're quite different. One is fiscal sustainability, and globally, that's what people are focusing on right now. I mean, any growth model that is based on running large fiscal deficits is going to lead to a buildup of debt. And if the debt to GDP ratio keeps rising and becomes unsustainable, that would in effect lead to a loss of investor confidence, etc. And that's a very important consideration, but actually we are not in bad shape from that point of view. There are serious fiscal sustainability issues about the industrialized world. Now, if India grows at 9%, or even if it grows a little less than 9%, the kind of fiscal deficit we are talking about will bring reductions in the debt to GDP ratio. So frankly, I feel that the fiscal situation is something we have to be watching all the time, but I don't think that there's a lack of sustainability in the Indian story on the fiscal side. Now, the other use of the term sustainability, of course, is with regard to the use of natural resources, impact on the environment, and so on. Now, I believe that this issue of sustainability is now coming to the forefront, not only in India, but in many, many emerging market countries. And I think we do have to have a much clearer strategy for environmental sustainability.
We've actually seen various factions of the government be at loggerheads as far as that part of the sustainability is concerned. I'm going to come back to you, take this discussion forward. But while we were talking about growth versus inflation, a lot of it has to do with monetary policy, and which is why I want to throw this discussion open to Chetan Iyer once again. Chetan, which side of the debate are you on? I mean, many of us believe that perhaps Governor Subbarao has done the right thing by going in for an aggressive monetary tightening. But the fact of the matter is that many around the world also believe that the RBI has been a little too late in doing that.
It's not fair to judge the central bank hindsight. They had the information on their hand at that point of time, and that's what they decided. I guess hindsight, probably even they would appreciate the fact that the rates probably would have needed to go up faster and earlier.
Montek Singh Ahluwalia, I know, like Chetan and like Punita, you would perhaps not want to judge the RBI in hindsight, but the question also is that the RBI has been a little behind the curve. You'll have to agree with me, because they haven't been able to tame inflation, and they are threatening growth like never before.
Well, look, it's clear that if you look back, RBI made a series of steps increasing the short-term interest rate. You could argue that the fact that they did a series of steps suggested that, inflation was more difficult to control than they had thought. And in that sense, you could argue that in hindsight, that maybe they should have done more earlier. I think on the whole, the RBI has done what it can in the right direction as far as monetary policy is concerned. I mean, you've got to remember that monetary policy is not a science, it's an art. What they do in future actually depends on what happens to prices. Well, the RBI has the option to reverse its signals. I mean, one of the great advantages of short-term policy, unlike short-term monetary policy, unlike fiscal policy, is that it can respond quickly. I mean, you don't reissue a budget, but you could in fact tighten or loosen monetary policy depending on circumstances.
I'm keeping my fingers crossed and hoping that Governor Subbarao is indeed listening to you. I've been reeling under those home loans a tad too much right now. But Jahangir Aziz, I know you're far more I don't know, should I use the word candid here? And I know you will give me a more honest opinion. Don't you think the RBI has done whatever it has done, but a little too late?
I think that's a fair point. I think with 2020 hindsight, RBI would have agreed that, look, we shouldn't have paused in December 2010. We should have probably done the 50 basis point rate hike back in January. Even in May, when we did the 50 basis points rate hike, we should have followed it up with another 50 basis points rate hike rather than go 25 and then come back to 50. I think in 2020 hindsight, that's perfectly a reasonable argument to make. And I would say that that has been, some of the, we have been arguing for quite some time that the RBI has been behind the curve. And we've been arguing this, since middle of 2010. So it is not a recent argument that we're making.
Let's talk about fiscal discipline. That indeed has been a big cause of concern for global investors, which is why I'm going to ask Punita Kumar Sinha, fiscal discipline, ma'am. 4.6% fiscal deficit, I know, is always high, but even in the present scenario, we're beginning to question whether that is achievable or not.
I mean, I think it's ambitious because to achieve that number, you have to have buoyant tax collections, you have to have buoyant equity markets so the government can hit its divestment targets. And I'm not so sure either of those are going to get accomplished. But again, having said that, one of the big concerns that does worry me about India is, we are seeing problems in Europe, we are seeing problems in the US because of high debt levels. And I think as an economy, India also has fairly high debt levels and a high fiscal deficit. And therefore, there is, concerns about India's credit rating going forward, and what that does to interest rates in India, and risk premium towards Indian both debt and equity markets.
I'm glad you're talking about risks, because I am going to turn this debate to Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Mr. Ahluwalia, how would you want to address concerns of global investors like Punita? She did speak about fiscal deficit, which is really high, and she also believes you cannot achieve it. What are some of the tools that you know in Pranab Mukherjee's kit that we perhaps do not?
Well, we are sort of in the 5th month or something of that kind. I think it's very odd to come to the conclusion that we can't achieve the target. We're underestimating the instruments that are actually available to the government. As far as I know, the concern is, first of all, that growth may be below target this year. However, although growth is going to be lower than was mentioned at the time of the budget, the early indications we have suggest that revenues seem to be moving on target. The other point is that, ultimately a fiscal deficit can also be contained by containing expenditure. So, in a way, the Finance Ministry has a lot of flexibility in simply not approving new expenditure requests.
All right, not approving expenditure is perhaps one of the reasons how they could be curtailing fiscal deficit, and Pranab Mukherjee perhaps is going to intently listen to Montek Singh Ahluwalia. But let's take this discussion to another area that is a cause of concern, and that's private investment, which is really languishing. It's being attributed to various factors, to some of the governance issues that are also making headlines. Chetan Iyer, as somebody who's more objective, sitting in Hong Kong and looking at this debate, issues of governance, private investment is languishing. What would you attribute this to?
So there are lots of factors affecting private investments. We have a situation right now where there's a question mark on the global growth outlook. We have a situation where global capital markets have not been good. Domestic inflation and interest rates are at a fairly high level. And then we have, in addition, these issues of graft-related investigations. So I think it's a combination of all of these factors which are affecting private investments.
All right, so many factors, but graft included is the point that Chetan Iyer is making. Punita Kumar Sinha, let me ask you this question. When you look at it from a global investor's point of view, and not as an Indian we're talking to on this show, issues like these exist in many countries. So do you tell me here that a lot of global investors are perhaps beginning to rethink their India strategy despite these issues remaining in various economies, or do you think the growth prospects will get them to India any which way?
Global investors are looking for growth at reasonable valuations across the world, and so to the extent that they can find that in India, they will invest that money in India if they're comfortable with the valuations. And we talked about governance, and of course India has governance issues, but India is not alone in having governance issues. A lot of emerging economies have governance issues.
All right. India isn't alone in having those governance issues. We do wish, however, we were singled out for not having those issues. But Jahangir Aziz, you're not someone who attributes private investment languishing to governance issues like our two other panelists have.
Private investment actually hasn't picked up, has been languishing since Lehman. And one of the factors, I think, we always come up with these ad hoc reasons for it. Approvals, questions about governance, etc., being the hindrance to inflation, to investment. But one of the real, hindrance to inflation or investment has been the sheer macroeconomic uncertainty and instability. If I, as a corporate, do not know when inflation is going to peak and when growth is going to trough, it means that I really do not know when or what is going to be my part of my wages, what is going to be the part of my capital cost, because I don't know how the central bank or lending rates are going to react to this continued high inflation. So in a sense, almost half my cost is very uncertain. In that world, it looks very, very difficult for a corporate to say, look, I'm going to invest $1 billion for 3 years.
All right, so it's not just graft and governance issues that is languishing private investment. Corporates perhaps are finding it a tad too difficult to decide what do they need to do, because there is no definite edge that they have whether inflation is going to trough or growth is going to crest. Fair point, Jahangir Aziz. But Montek Singh Ahluwalia, as somebody who is a part of decision making, as somebody who's a part of government, governance is an issue. You cannot deny that. The question that I'm putting forward to you is that what is the government doing on that front? I mean, you will not admit on camera perhaps, but otherwise private investment is languishing, and one of the reasons is governance.
It's not clear to me what people mean by governance. Are they referring to some of the big corruption cases that have been in the news? Are they referring just to general efficiency of government, ease of doing business, transactions costs, etc.? I think there are implementation delays, which don't have to do with any long-term view of the economy, but they arise because environment clearances, land acquisition, these are difficult areas where I believe our systems have not been very transparent. They need to be changed. They are being changed. And I think if people recognize that we are moving towards fast-tracking some of these things, the concerns on investment will automatically improve.
Chetan Iyer, are you proud of what we've achieved in the last 64 years?
Absolutely. India is today the second fastest growing economy in the world, and I think the toughest role for India has been to ensure that the development process has been taken ahead with a political setup which is democratic. And there has always been believed to be a challenge for an emerging market. So I think that, in my mind, seems to be the biggest achievement for India, that with the democratic setup on the political front, India has managed to take the economic development to a new level and at the same time achieve the reduction in poverty.
All right, so from one proud Indian to hopefully another, Preeta Kumar Sinha, you left this country many years back to find many opportunities in the United States. You keep coming back and investing here. But as a global Indian, are you proud of what we've achieved, say, in the last 64 years of independence and also 20 years of economic reforms? Let's not lose sight of that.
One has to be quite proud of how the Indian equity market has evolved over this time, and how it's gotten deeper during this time as well. So now turning back to the economy obviously, as a global Indian too, there has been significant changes in India. When I was a student in India and before I left for the US many years ago, you didn't even have a landline phone. You didn't have, there was no concept of cell phones obviously at the time. Gas connections were very hard to come by. There weren't that many cars. There has been a huge amount of change and progress in India. One of the biggest changes that I have seen over the last 20 years is job creation. When I was growing up, there was employment was one very big issue for the Indian economy, because there weren't enough good jobs and there weren't enough opportunities for young Indians, and people like us went overseas to seek those opportunities. And today India is an economy and a land of opportunity. and people are finding a lot of jobs here. In fact, there's shortage of talent.
All right, so much has changed for India in the last 64 years, especially after the economic liberalization that did happen about 20 years back. My last question to Montek Singh Ahluwalia, who's perhaps going to change India in times to come. As a part of policy making in this country, what do you think is going to be a cornerstone when you look at India, say, in the next 20 years?
Now, looking forward, we're about to start the 12th plan. We're going to do that in an environment where the economy internally has many reasons to be more self-confident. Externally, the global environment is very uncertain, but on the other hand, the real problem there is the industrialized countries. I think globally, emerging market countries are doing quite well, and India is a leader in that area. I believe that in the next 5 years, we should be targeting a growth rate of something like 9%. Frankly, unless we have the political will and the determination, and not just in the central government, it has to be the central government and the state governments, because many of the actions needed to get to high growth are actions that have to be taken at the state government level. And frankly, looking 20 years ahead, the fact is India is now poised for a transition to a sustained high growth path. The impact on employment, the impact on the quality of employment, the impact on poverty will be enormous, and India will not be recognizable 20 years later.